Hello, and welcome to another podcast from Witches T. Flint. My name is Devana, and I'm the founder. Witches T. Flint is a witchy organization out of Flint, Michigan that hosts local charities, and we have an online store at witchestflint.com that has magical implements, teas, we have readings, astrology charts, and other tools. I'm so happy that you found us and found the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. I love a good backstory of why things are the way they are. Knowledge is power, and it gives us a roadmap of where not to go better than ways, because ways get you lost sometimes. So in this podcast, we call it Magical Musings, where we take a topic that we're thinking about and just dive into how it corresponds to witchcraft. I let Spirit lead me into what to talk about, and Spirit's already given me a really long list. But this one was the top of the list every single time, and I couldn't understand why, because I didn't know all of the history myself. It took a little bit of digging for this one. I received confirmation of how important this topic is because a friend of ours, she liked that she was going to listen to one of our other podcasts, Spilling the Tea. You know how Facebook works, where you say that you're interested in an event, or you say that you're going to an event, it pops up on your page. You have friends that can comment on it. They can say that they're going or interested themselves, or they can like, oh, this sounds really cool. Dale had that happen, and someone responded to that with some pretty nasty comments. And it just made me realize how important this topic is. Let me just first start off by saying that witchcraft is not satanic. There are satanic witches, and honestly, they're not as bad as what you've been led to believe. So let's just get that out in the open. And for anyone who's ever been told that witchcraft is satanic, or felt like their soul was in jeopardy, or just felt bad about their love for the craft, you have nothing to feel bad about. You have nothing to feel remorse about for being a witch. There's nothing wrong with being a witch. There are many kinds of witches, which we'll go into in a later podcast. You can still be a Christian and be a witch. It is possible. And we'll go into some of the histories of that may explain why that's more possible than you think. If you were to do a Google search on the origins of witchcraft, you'll probably get some really odd hits. Most likely you'll find a whole lot of information regurgitated about the Salem witch trials. Both you and I know that witchcraft is a lot older than that. What you're finding is it's a little difficult to find the actual origins of where everything started. Witchcraft is as old as time itself, and there was a time when being a witch was no cause for alarm or shock. There was a time when you went to see a witch to fix your love life, to improve your health, to bestow a bounty of crops, to fix what was going on with your prized heifer. Oftentimes, when you would ask a witch for help, you would bring a trinket to show appreciation. Sometimes people in desperate need of help would leave an IOU, fully aware of the potential consequences if they did not fulfill their end of the bargain. And most of the time, you were okay with that because you knew that, hey, I got a service, I didn't pay for service rendered, do what you're gonna do to me, I know the ramifications. But most of the time, you went to a witch because you needed a healing or an unbiased ear. This was someone who fixed whatever was going wrong. So what happened? Well, let's talk about where this witch hysteria started. We're going to bounce all over this timeline, so this is how my ADD brain works. Just buckle up. Between 1400 and 1792, there were 40,000 to 60,000 people, men, women, and children, that were put to death for witchcraft, and this is verified by European historical censuses. My Scottish ancestor Agnes was sentenced to death, but escaped death due to a lack of evidence. It's actually in the Scottish witch trials paperwork. Really, really odd stuff. What happened to the evidence? We'll never know. But I do know that they ended up in Canada a few months later. So how did one become convicted, and why was witchcraft all of a sudden this crime? When did we go from, yeah, we've had some pretty nasty weather and that made us really nervous about getting through the winter, to blame the witches? Well, the answer is the Holy Wars. But these weren't wars fought like what we see now. This was a battle for your soul and salvation and for your money by the newly emerging Protestants and the Catholic Dominion. Across Europe from the 1300s to the 1800s, people were noticing colder than normal winters. It was kind of strange. People were keeping records of that and saw a pattern and saw that Europe kind of went through this mini ice age. They also noticed that there was some floods, some huge hailstorms and some mind-blowing infestations of mice. This was also at the time that people started killing the cats because they thought that cats were witches that went to cause all this crazy stuff. Notably, there was also a strange infestation of caterpillars, which we'd be pretty gleeful over right now, considering that meant butterflies were coming. But people back then had no idea what we would do for butterflies now. We have the mice problem that helped cause the Black Plague, and then you're scratching your head about caterpillars and why this was an issue. The big problem with the whole caterpillar infestation is not only eating the crops, but these caterpillars had these like little tiny hairs on them that would get caught in the wind and then blow away and get on people's skin and get in people's eyes. They were toxic and caused an allergic reaction. Think of what happens to you when you get around something that you're really, really allergic to. Well, this is what this caterpillar's hair did to everybody. And we didn't have Benadryl back then. We didn't have prednisone back then. So you saw a lot of people dying from fairly treatable allergic reactions. Guess who they blamed? So that started a little bit of a panic also in certain villages, but it didn't go very far. Now, in the early days of what's called modern Europe, people were finding themselves really disenchanted with the Catholic Church. And this new sect of faith was emerging, Protestantism, which was basically a protest of the hypocritical and elitist practices of the Catholic Church. If this sounds oddly familiar to what's going on right now, take notes. There was also a shift at this time where churches moved from your typical spiritual services, a few songs, a few Hail Marys, sprinkle some holy water here, do a couple of prayers. What was really funny is that the priests would pretend to heal the sick, but they were friends with the witches. So the witches were actually the ones that were doing the healing. The priests were the ones that got the credit for it. This is verifiable. The big problem with all of this, though, is these healing services were available for a price. And if you had the money for it, you were going to be able to get the healing, which seemed really unfair to some of the impoverished people that didn't have deep pockets. And they were giving what they had, but what they had wasn't giving someone silver or giving someone money. They may have had a chicken, but if you have someone that can give, a couple pounds of silver, that's a lot more. So they're going to get the actual healing where somebody else might get a placebo. So as you can see, something was starting to shift. People were starting to take notice and realizing that the Catholic Church didn't really look very churchy. It looked kind of like a business. And there were hungry souls who were needing something more. And a hungry soul will pretty much devour just about anything that looks different from what it's seen over and over again, which is where this man Martin Luther comes in. And he had a whole new shtick. It was all about your salvation. He also had a thing for hating on witches. It became all about delivering your ever-living soul from the bowels of hell, but only if you believe in what they tell you to believe. Sad things haven't changed much in 700 plus years. Churches had a way of acting kind of like an OxyClean infomercial before we could ever even push add to cart. But instead of whiter and brighter clothes, it was all about whiter and brighter souls. They had to keep the audience engaged and handled service almost like an election rally. And that lasted for, a while. This fear-mongering, it's a really powerful motivating tool. The Catholic Church also started speaking on salvation about that time, about your soul and getting out of hell. So their association with the witches was getting less and less public, and how can a church be all powerful if they're getting all their goods from the witches, right? So this guy, German monk Martin Luther, he grew tired of the Catholic Church preachy get out of hell free cards if only you had enough money. He called the church out on it. And by calling them out, well, he nailed these 95 theses to the door of the church and word spread all over. Eventually those theses got banned, by the way, and people got really, really angry in the Catholic Church about Martin Luther. Martin Luther called bullshit on that. And the next thing you know, people started to follow him because much of what he said made sense, that wealth and status shouldn't be guaranteeing your salvation. So with the battle stage set between Catholicism and Protestantism in Europe, Germany, Switzerland, so much for being neutral, guys. The French, the British, parts of Scandinavia, Luxembourg. It's like new and interesting ways to kill the witches. And the witches became a clever moniker for anyone who was neutral. So if you didn't take a side, if you weren't Catholic, if you weren't Protestant, all of a sudden it's like, oh, you must be a witch then. Most of the people were like, yeah, I'm gonna get up out of here and go home because this is kind of crazy. And they saw some pretty brutal deaths that did win over some independent outliers for no other reason than self-preservation and survival. So the earliest executions were carried out by the Protestants, and the Catholics grew really nervous that their followers would lose interest, so the Catholics had to make it that much bigger. They totally dialed up these massacres. Catholics had to outdo the Protestants. Protestants had to outdo the Catholics. Next thing you know, that's how you get 40 to 60,000 people dead. So how did they get people to think that witches were bad? Well, they told some horrible lies. They followed this Swiss playbook from the 1400s, and the Swiss playbook told them all of these different ways that you could identify a witch and how you could kill a witch and make sure that witches were done for. The Swiss thought back in the 1400s that they had eradicated the witches, and word spread how. Before this time, though, witches were never perceived as satanic or evil. But in order to sway and instill fear, witches had to be made out to be as vile as humanly possible. Stories of children being murdered and babies boiled for their fat to be smeared on the witches' brooms because baby fat makes witches' brooms fly. And villagers were told that witches traveled on these baby fat smeared broomsticks by night to secret witch gatherings in order to commune with the devil, thus beginning the Great Hunt era of the European witch trials. Traveling men who resembled Friar Tuck but not as friendly told these tales of witches with each village that they went to. And what they would do is they would find a village that had a certain malady happen to it, and they would twist the story to, well, we were just at this village and we couldn't save them, but we could possibly save you. You know, people always want to believe that they have some sort of a fighting chance, if only. I mean, there's a lot of power there. And we all cling to like that bargaining chip for most of our lives. So Protestantism was catching on. The Catholic Church wasn't having it. So the Catholic Church created the Malleus Maleficarum, which is the Hammer of the Witches. This is a book written by a German Catholic in 1487 that sold more copies than the Bible. It's basically a lie-infested rag that puts Star Magazine and National Enquirer to shame in a tell-all about witches. It's how to identify a witch, and the kicker, how to kill one. So here we have the beginnings of evangelicalism, because Protestants and Catholic priests were telling these outlandish tales to win over the public. Now, the actual Holy Wars had conflicting information about how long it lasted, but it would seem that the worst of it was roughly about 30 years, because they have what they call the 30-year war. Well, it may not be the 300 plus years the whole mess lasted from start to finish. The sheer brutality of the 30 years is longer than any Stephen King saga. Did I forget to mention that the Protestants called their state Bohemia? It refers to the Christianization of an area of the Czech Republic that was once called Bohemia. I don't think I'll ever sing La Vie Bohème the same way again. While we don our hats this season and raise our brooms while raiding Dollar Tree, Spirit Halloween, and Michael's, we live in a time when it's safer to do so. Be sure to light a candle for those who were executed because two churches wanted more members and more money. Witches and witchcraft have never been the enemy, but we were used to further an agenda of propaganda that spun us to be attacked. This podcast today only touched briefly on the deaths of the witches of Europe. There are many, many more stories to tell, including the U.S. colonies' involvement. The witch trials here in the American colonies was just getting cooking by the time this was all done in Europe. I'm sad that people were so brainwashed by a sinister agenda that they relinquished the magical connection that they have to the earth. Witchcraft is a connection to the earth, and there's nothing evil about that at all. We're the doorways that show you all of the magic around you, and it is our loss of connection which causes much of the earth's suffering. I'm proud to call myself a witch because I have that connection to nature and to the animals and to the elements. We all do. We just have to choose to see it and know that it all comes from the same source, and there's nothing evil about that. Join me for more magical musings next time, and be sure to like Witches T. Flint on Facebook and Instagram, and check out our website at witchestflint.com. Have yourself a wonderful evening or day wherever you are, and we will talk to you again soon.